Tales Under the Oak, The Toad Folk 2, The Festival. Every year, exactly in the middle of autumn, the toads from all over the kingdom would gather in the southern part of the woodlands on the border with the royal marshes to celebrate the long-awaited holiday, simply called the Mid-Autumn Festival, or the Festival of the Full Autumn Moon. Initially on this day, the locals from the capital humbly celebrated the birth of King Grog the Wise, the glorious ruler of the Toad Kingdom. The event was celebrated at the castle gates with 3 blows on the royal trumpet, followed by a dull, croaking, "Eternal memory to the glorious king, the herald of change." After that, everyone would slowly return to their business. Over time, the folk from nearby towns and villages adopted the tradition, transformed it, and eventually turned it into a big celebration, embracing the last warm days of the year. Toads, a peace-loving and cold-blooded folk, rarely held noisy parties. All important dates were celebrated modestly in the family circle. However, the Mid-Autumn Festival became an exception, and every year the toad folk tried to outdo themselves. The holiday became larger, louder, and more cheerful. So it was on the Jubilee's 200th time, when the woodland town of Frogling at the crossroads of the main road leading to the royal marshes was drowning in music, toad ale, and the laughter of little toads until the scarlet sunset, and after that the most interesting part of the festival began. According to tradition, the toads staged bizarre dances, lit huge fires and jumped over them with loud croaking, burning their beards and robes. After the wild dancing, the elder toads ate special mushrooms with herbs and told stories and fairy tales to the younger generation in the Cave of Legends. The festival ended with the launch of amazing kites with multicolored lanterns in the shape of lizards, toads, slugs, and dragonflies. It is no wonder that after the celebration, every little toad in the kingdom talked about the Mid-Autumn Festival for months and looked forward to the next year. The huge orange disk of the sun had already disappeared behind the dark green canvas of the forest, and among the dancing shadows on the ancient trunks showed up a large mossy hill with a black passage into the Cave of Legends. Next to it, on a stump, sat an elderly toad in an emerald felt cap, watching the dancing around the fire with delight. Finally, the toad straightened up, shook the ashes from his grey beard and cape embroidered with silk patterns, and struck hard with an oak stick on a massive copper bell at the end of his staff. "Listen here, Toad and Bogling. The hour of tales has come to Frogling. Wrap your cloak and go ahead. Among the legends now you tread." The old toad cleared his throat after these words, and loudly added, "Krog the storyteller is eagerly awaiting the inhabitants and guests of Frogling in the Cave of Legends." Inside, the cave was illuminated by a shimmering turquoise light emanating from the mushrooms on long stalks sticking out of the grey stone. It was humid, and translucent steam rose around the silhouette of the storyteller. Thin streams of water, flowing from cracks in the walls and running down a smooth gutter in the floor, merged into a soothing rustle. A wonderful background for listening to stories. All this made a great impression on the toads entering, especially the children, whose jaws were wide open. When everyone had settled into their places on the long stone steps, Krog struck his bell again, awakening a deep, hypnotic echo, and began his story. The Toads and the Giant Thistle. In a small fishing village on the western bank of the Lily River, there lived a little toad Drog and his sister Brocka. They were cheerful, curious children, and were constantly getting into all sorts of strange adventures. So it happened this time as well, when they were helping their parents untangle the fishing nets on the shore by the evening, while the adults were preparing dinner in their rickety mushroom hut. From behind the river island, a stranger toad in a small lily-pad boat swam up to them. He was wearing a torn dark blue cloak with a hood thrown over the head. The children were unable to see the toad's face, but they noticed its sly smile.
"Greetings, little ones," the toad croaked. "I see that you are busy, but I also have a certain business here."
The toad waved its paw, pointing to the junk in its lily pad. There was everything there: numerous jars with dried herbs and berries, rusty tools and arrows, a wet rope, stinking dead fish, and a bunch of bags of different sizes with unknown contents. After carefully looking around, the stranger leaned forward and said,
"I see you are smart little toads, and will not miss the chance to get something extremely rare. I would not give this to anyone just like that, but I have not eaten for so long that I will soon fall off the boat into the water. If you had taken pity on the old traveller and exchanged that box of fish for one valuable bag with rare seeds from the depths of the woodlands, you would not have regretted such a deal at all."
Drog's eyes lit up, and he nodded quickly. Brocka was wary at first, but quickly lost her vigilance after the subsequent scene with the toad's reluctance to exchange the valuable bag for a handful of some river fish. The stranger winced, sighed heavily, and finally offered,
"You can take the bag if, in addition to the fish, you give me this strong fishing net, so that the old man could feed himself on the way." That was the agreement, and soon a heavy cloth bag with soil and seeds appeared in the paws of the little toads, and the mysterious toad was already quickly moving away along the river. When the figure in the cloak completely dissolved in the water, the brother and sister realized that they had not even asked what kind of seeds these were. They felt very stupid, lowered their heads and trudged home, dragging the bag behind them. Entering their mushroom house with a blue cap that had leaned over to one side, the children told their parents, who had already set the table for dinner, about what had happened. The father loved his little toads, but he had a quick temper. He got very angry and, throwing a plate of fish on the table, said sharply, "Maybe you should invite him to our home next time and cook him a delicious dinner. We gave such a good net to a stranger, and all the fish we caught. Tomorrow we will have to go to the market empty-handed. How will we live for the rest of the week?"
Drog began to cry, and Brocka began to defend herself and her brother.
"But what if these really are rare seeds of some useful plant? If so, we could sell them to the alchemist who comes to the market from the capital. He probably understands such things."
The father softened a little, and, tucking his paws into his checkered waistcoat, replied,
"You have been deceived, children. I hope this will teach you not to trust the kind smile of eloquent toads next time."
After these words, He sighed deeply and went up the spiral staircase to the bedroom. The mother, of course, understood that the children had made a big mistake, but she came up and hugged the brother and sister.
"There is nothing to be done now, my dears," she said. "Be more careful in the future. Throw away the soil with the seeds behind the fence by the trees, and give me the bag. It will come in handy for the farm."
Brocker and Drog went out into the fresh air. It was already dark, and the stars were scattered across the black sky above the river. The children crossed the garden and crawled between the logs in the low fence. They decided to empty the contents of the bag a little further away, into a small peat hole next to an old willow.
"Let's go home and quickly forget about today,"
said Brocker to her brother, and after taking one last breath of cold air to the chirping of crickets, the children went to bed. It had been raining all night, and the sky was covered with thick clouds. It was not yet light when the parents took the cart with salted fish from the previous week to the market early in the morning. The children were left to do the housework, and when Drog and Brocker woke up, they immediately began to sweep the dust from the kitchen and wash the wooden dishes after a light vegetable breakfast. Brocker carried the bucket of dirty water out into the garden and almost fell over in surprise. In the place where she and her brother had thrown the contents of the bag, a dozen huge stems with pointed leaves and barely opened inflorescences at the very top had grown. Brocker could not believe her eyes. She looked at the bright purple petals breaking through the green tops, and the water from the bucket slowly poured out onto her paws.
"Drog!"
she screamed, finally coming to her senses.
"Drog, come here quickly!"
The brother jumped out of the back door and stood rooted to the spot.
"Am I still asleep, or are there really giant thistles in front of us?"
he whispered.
"We are not asleep, Drog,"
laughed Brocker.
"The stranger did not deceive us. Do you understand?"
All this did not fit into their heads, and while they laughed loudly and spread their paws with cries, marvelling at this miracle of nature, the villagers began to gather around. Some silently and even with fear looked from afar. Others, like the brother and sister, were shouting in delight. The news of the giant thistles that appeared out of nowhere spread around the area so quickly that an hour later the parents returned home with company. They were followed by a young toad with shining eyes, dressed in an unusual knitted cape with an embroidered mustard-coloured tower. Before the parents could somehow express their surprise, after pulling off their hats, the companion said loudly and politely,
"Good morning to you. I am Albog, the royal alchemist."
Then the father of the family came to his senses and asked uncertainly,
"What is this fuss about? Why are you all crowded around our house?" "You tell us that,"
echoed from the crowd.
"Indeed," agreed Albog. "What is this extremely rare plant doing next to your house?"
Everyone hesitated for a moment.
"And what is your interest?"
Brocker suddenly intervened from behind the fence, resting her paws on her hips.
"My interest is purely scientific."
Albog cleared his throat.
"You see, firstly, the petals of the giant thistle are very valuable in my business, and secondly, I have no idea how it grew here, in such an accessible place."
Albog thought for a moment, rubbed his chin and asked,
"Could you lend me a couple of petals for my experiments? It's been a while since I've seen thistles among the deliveries to my laboratory." "We couldn't,"
interrupted Drog sharply.
"But we could sell them. The price will be higher than the market price, though since one still has to climb up to the flowers,
added Brocker, holding back a smile and exchanging a sly glance with her brother.
"And there are a lot of needles on the leaves."
"Smart kids," the alchemist burst out laughing and nodded towards their parents, who still didn't understand anything, but were smiling blissfully.
"We'll discuss the details in your hut over a mug of ale. Would you mind taking us inside?"
No one ever learned the details of the conversation in the mushroom hut, but Grog and Brocker's family had noticeably improved their situation. Once a week, a messenger would come to them, pick up a carefully prepared bunch of thistle petals, and take them to the royal castle. Father and Mother no longer fished and spent most of their time knitting, carving wood and taking long walks along the river. And when Brocker and Grog grew up, the family's savings were enough to send them to study in the royal marshes. Grog found his place in the School of Spear and Bow, and Brocker decided to apply her intelligence to perseverance to the Royal Mage Academy. Did the stranger in the lily-pad boat know that he gave the children rare and very valuable seeds? It is unlikely, but he certainly played a key role in the further fate of the little toads.
"Boring tales,"
shouted one small impudent toad from a stone bench.
"We want scary ones."
Grog, the storyteller, cast a sharp glance at the listeners.
"Well then, listen to this one,"
he boomed, wrapping himself tighter in his cloak. The Toad and the Armoured Slug. It was a long time ago on one gloomy autumn day. From behind the wet juniper bushes appeared a large slug-head, which slowly turned left and right, obviously searching for a way. The slug crawled out entirely, and it turned out that it was dressed in shiny plate armour, skillfully fastened with soft leather. Each steel plate was engraved with an image of the royal castle. On the broad back of the slug sat a stern-looking toad in a light leather breastplate, and with a long spear in its paw.
"A wonderful day to get lost,"
muttered the toad, sniffling its cold nose. The guard toad had been on the road for a week now, carrying out an important mission from the royal marshes. However, crossing the woodlands from the north, the guard lost the main road towards the castle due to heavy rain and got lost. Even the slug's good sense of smell failed it, although these creatures from the stables of the royal castle perfectly knew the way to any large city in the swamp kingdom. The rain and gusts of wind greatly confused its sensitive nose, and so the guard on the slug gazed around the unfamiliar forest area under the rain that had already softened. Gnarled pine trees stuck out everywhere, clearly not getting enough sunlight. The soil was loose and hilly, covered with wet, dark green moss. There was nowhere to make a stop here. Suddenly, the toad noticed a dark path covered with lingonberry bushes behind the tall grass. The path led to the side behind the slope of the ravine. There was nowhere else to go, and he moved along it with the hope of crawling out onto the main road. The toad was following the path along a steep ravine for a long time, when it gradually disappeared into the thick grass. On the right was an inaccessible slope with angular roots sticking out of the ground, and on the left began dangerous forest swamps where no one lived. The dim sun, behind the grey canvas of clouds, was already sinking toward the horizon, and when the guard was about to turn the slug around and crawl back, he heard the soft buzzing of wings behind a bunch of young birches. A moment later, a large coal-black dragonfly smoothly flew up to him. They stared at each other for a while, and then the dragonfly flew forward, turning around a couple of times as if inviting him to follow it. Either the guard was too tired, or some force pushed him forward, so he obediently crawled on the slug after the dragonfly. It turned out that a little further, behind numerous islands of birches, a strip of dense old forest began. The dragonfly hung near a narrow passage between two trees with uneven bark, which intertwined at the top, forming a peculiar arch. The sight of this forest alarmed the toad.
"I don't like this place,"
whispered the guard to his slug, which began to breathe noticeably faster and nervously toss under the toad. The dragonfly seemed to understand his words. It flew up to the guard and stared at him with its large azure netty eyes. The toad was enchanted and could not take its eyes off the dragonfly. The guard heard a pleasant, high voice.
"Trust me, guard. I will lead you to the main road, and tonight you will sleep in your soft, warm bed."
The approaching darkness and cold wind left no time for long reflections, and the guard lit a torch and followed the dragonfly into the blackening passage through the forest gates. The slug crawled slowly and with great effort between the sticking-out roots and low-growing spruce branches. After the dragonfly's words, the toad obediently followed, as if in a dream, into the depths of the dense forest. The crackling of the burning torch resonated and filled the space between the trunks huddled around the narrow passage, and it seemed as if the guard was in a crypt. At times, the toad seemed to hear quiet, unkind voices, as if the trees were whispering among themselves, discussing the uninvited guests. The dragonfly turned every now and then and flew up to the toad to make sure that it was still moving forward. The further the slug crawled along the passage, the more viscous the soil became. The trees completely covered the sky, and it became difficult to breathe. Large drops of rain could be heard hitting their ancient treetops. A sudden clap of thunder rolled across the woodlands and instantly awakened the guard toad from his magical sleep. The veil receded from its consciousness, and he saw in what a frightening situation he found himself. The dragonfly twitched between the trunks and muttered in a nasty, giggling voice something like,
"Another drowner,
and
the forest will be pleased."
The passage with solid ground was left somewhere behind, and the slug meanwhile began to sink into the swampy soil under the weight of its armour. Greatly frightened, the guard jumped off the slug and began to tear off the heavy steel plates from it, which fell with a loud slap into the swamp and sank. The guard shoved his spear under the slug's belly and used it as a lever, pushing the creature back to solid ground with great effort. Then he grabbed a torch with an orange flame, raised it high above his head, and shouted,
"Go away, evil spirit of the forest! I see your essence!"
At that moment, the dragonfly let out a terrible cry that echoed loudly through the old forest, turning into a black cloud and disappeared into the swamp thicket. The guard managed to get out of the terrible place along a narrow path, and by morning he and his faithful slug reached the royal marshes. He didn't want to sleep, much less be alone after such a nightmare, and he headed to the nearest tavern by the northern gate to drink a mug of toad ale, wash it all down with fried bread, and pour out his soul to the local drunks. No one believed his story, but the guard didn't care. He needed company and a piece of bread in his belly. As he finished the last sip of tart ale with a grassy taste, he remembered with a smile how his mother told him a legend about an evil spirit of the forest at night. This spirit could not show itself to toads and other inhabitants of the woodlands, and therefore appeared to everyone in the form of animals, birds, and insects. Those who believed it disappeared without a trace. When its true form was exposed, the spirit lost its strength and could not command someone else's will. That's how an ordinary bedtime story saved the guard toad from death in the old forest. After this tale, the mood in the Cave of Legends noticeably changed. The elder toads whispered to each other, and the young ones thoughtfully looked at the damp walls in the mystical light.
"We want the legend about Ungolokk, Krog,"
said one old toad, who had already witnessed about 80 festivals with listening to tales in the cave.
Yes, yes,
supported the other toads.
"Very well. The word of the folk is law,"
answered Krog, and poured some pollen from a leather bag into the flowing stream. The water hissed, and a thick cloud of smoke rose into the air, and after a moment the mushrooms, emitting turquoise light, suddenly glowed dark red, making the shadows in the cave even blacker and deeper, and the attention of the listeners sharper. Ungolokk's Gift. Long ago, when the swamps were wild and toads could not speak, life was in full swing in a small pond under the mountains to the north. Dragonflies and midges scurried about in the cool air among the cattails. Crickets sang in the bushes under the willows, and the tails and heads of fish appeared on the surface of the water every now and then, and on the widest lily pad sat an old blind toad. She was no different from other toads of that era, except for her blindness and the enormous patience that had developed over a long, sightless life. It so happened that the pond in which she lived was at the foot of a high, dark mountain, with a gorge splitting it in half. An obvious name was later given to this gorge, the Gorge of the Amphibian Gods, because it was from there that Ungolokk once emerged, giving the toads speech and art as its great gift. And the very first words spoken by the toad folk flew out of the mouth of that blind old toad. No one knows exactly what Ungolokk saw in her, and why he decided to give her knowledge, but most likely the god of amphibians was satisfied that she could not see him, as he never wished to be seen by anyone. And so Ungolokk left his ancient refuge in the mountains, summoned the old toad, and she followed him. He showed her the northern forests, the endless mountain ranges from which a fast river burst forth, falling onto the sharp black stones. He taught her to navigate the lily pad, showed her the impassable swamps. They walked around all the woodlands and plunged into the lush nature of the swamps in the south. Day and night they were on the road and talked about the past, present, and future, about simple trifles and about divine influence, about crafts and about art. Although the toad was old, Ungolokk's magic was stronger. Everything she saw and heard rejuvenated her and strengthened her spirit. So, several years passed, and when the time came to part, Ungolokk said,
"I taught you everything I could. Now go south and find an ancient oak that grows on the hills surrounded by swamps. Gather your folk there and pass on your knowledge to them."
The old toad was saddened by separation from her teacher, but she did as he asked. The toad wandered far from her home for a long time, until she finally found those lands and a huge old oak tree which stood alone on the flat top of a huge hill, wrapped in soft moss. Its massive roots loosened the soil and made many passages in it. The cold weather was approaching, and in order not to freeze, the toad decided to find a temporary shelter among the roots of an ancient tree. So the winter passed, then a whole year. Time passed quickly, and the toad got used to its new home, digging a whole system of tunnels under the oak. She still remembered Ungolokk's words, but did not understand what she needed to do. And so one day, when the winter ice melted and began to flow from the hills into the spring streams, the old toad crawled out of her shelter and sang a song about how she admired the lands she had seen during her long life. Birds began to flock to the toad's singing, snakes crawled up, and in the end, at least 100 of her own folk gathered near the oak, listening attentively to the song and trying to understand its meaning. The toads began to come to the oak every day, passing on the news of the powerful witch toad living under the old tree, and the old toad kept singing about and telling what she had seen and what she was thinking. So many years passed until the toad completely lost its strength. It crawled out of the roots less and less often, and one day she remained underground forever. And the attentive listeners, during all the time spent with the wise mentor, became smarter and learned to talk themselves. With the ability to talk came work and art, as well as magic, which flourished and transformed for centuries. The first intelligent toads eventually created the most beautiful thing they were capable of, the Toad Kingdom. They built a magnificent castle around the ancient oak and chose a leader among the wisest of the toads, laying the foundation for prosperity in the toad lands. And the oak tree still stands in the royal garden, striking everyone with its grandeur, from simple passing traders to newborn queens and kings. Everyone listened to Krog with open mouths, and the end of the legend was accompanied by loud jubilation. "Thank you, thank you!" Krog bowed with a wide smile. "And now, everyone quickly outside. They are already waiting for us to launch the kites." With cheerful cries, the toads rushed to the exit of the cave. In front of everyone, of course, ran the little ones, who were met by a kaleidoscope of heavenly lights. Orange, purple, and green kites twisted in a dance and shimmered under the starry sky. Loud music, clapping and croaking, filled the entire space, and everyone really wanted this festival to never end. The end.